Before we get into the video proper, I first want to thank you all for getting me to 100 subscribers. I honestly can't thank you enough, and I also wanted to let you know that after much deliberation, I've decided to go for longer videos released every 4 to 6 weeks, with maybe some smaller videos here and there to supplement them if I can, but no promises on smaller videos being released. Anyway, on with the video. When we think of travellers and explorers, we tend to have a very Europe-centric view of things. Names like Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus and Leif Erikson come to mind. But names of explorers who come from outside of Europe, regardless of how great they were, are rarely mentioned. Today we'll be looking at one such overlooked explorer, a man who was the most well-travelled old-world explorer in history, beating out even Marco Polo. The Muslim Moroccan Berber explorer and scholar called Ibn Battuta. Before we can get into the more exciting story of his travels, we must talk about both Ibn Battuta's early years and his religion, both of which are key to understanding him in his later years. The only account of Ibn Battuta's younger years come from his own autobiography, a gift to those who contemplate the wonders of cities and the marvels of travelling, more commonly known as the Rila. But I see no reason to doubt him on this topic, so we'll be taking him at his word. So according to the Rila, he was born in Tangier, in Morocco, to a family of Berber descent. In particular, the family he was born into was a family of Qadis, or Islamic scholars who act as judges for a Sharia court, as well as performing a myriad of other smaller tasks such as mediation, guardianship for orphans and minors, and the supervision and auditing of public works. Basically, they're a mix of judges, scholars, publishers, diplomats, and guardians. Born into a family of Qadis, it's doubtless that Ibn Battuta would have been expected to follow this path, and would have attended a Sunni Maliki madhab school. And this is where we need to speak of his religion. You see, Islam is a far more complex religion than many give it credit for, having different sects and schools of thought. Ibn Battuta was a Sunni Muslim, which is by far the most populous branch of Islam, so I won't spend time explaining it, but he also belonged to the Maliki school of thought. Now, the Maliki school of thought is to do with the interpretation of the law rather than actual theology, but as Ibn Battuta will act as a judge in the lands he travels to, it's still important you understand it. In particular, the Maliki tend to interpret the Quran in a more literal way. Malikis also see the social customs of the people of Medina, known as the Amal, as a valid secondary source of law after the Quran, where the other three schools of thought completely reject them as potential law sources. Malikis also, rather interestingly, hold the consensus of the companions of Muhammad as a lower source of law than they hold the customs of the people of Medina. So their hierarchy of authority, when it comes to law, goes Quran, trustworthy hadith, the Amal, then the consensus of Muhammad's companions. Before we continue, I just want to interject and mention that I'm using the H.A.R. Gibb translation of the Rila, which seems especially trustworthy, as H.A.R. Gibb was a historian that specialised in Arabic literature and was a professor at both Harvard and Oxford. Anyway, back to the story. With his younger years and religion explained, we can start to get into his first pilgrimage, which was of a religious nature. Obviously, that's what a pilgrimage is. You see, in Islam you are expected to undertake the religious pilgrimage to Mecca, known as the Hajj, at least once in your life. And in June 1325, at the young age of 21, Ibn Battuta decided, both out of religious obligation and of a desire to see other lands, that it was time he went on his Hajj. Little did he know that this Hajj would mark the beginning of one of the greatest adventures in history, and he wouldn't see his hometown for another 24 years. He neglected to travel by sea, instead following the coast on land to the sultanates of Abd al-Wadid and Hafsid. This route in particular took him through the major cities of Tlemcen, Bahia and Tunis, where he stayed for 2 months before continuing his journey. When he arrived in the town of Sfax, he married his first wife, but soon left her after he had a dispute with her father. This marriage is the beginning of Ibn Battuta's long-standing tradition of getting married whenever he settled in one place, only to divorce them shortly afterward when he inevitably found himself travelling again. Although I won't be mentioning his marriages very often because honestly they aren't relevant to his story. Just know that whenever he stops in a place for more than a month, he's getting married to someone. I had made a contrail of marriage at Sfax with the daughter of one of the syndics at Tunis, and at Tripoli she was conducted to me, But after leaving Tripoli, I became involved in a dispute with her father, which necessitated my separation from her. I then married the daughter of a student from Fez, and when she was conducted to me, I detained the caravan for a day by entertaining them all at a wedding party. So Ibn Battuta carried on, and in the early spring of 1326 he arrived in Alexandria, which he was thoroughly impressed by, writing about it in his autobiography. At length, on April 5th, 1326, we reached Alexandria. It is a beautiful city, well built and fortified with 4 gates and a magnificent port. Among all the ports in the world, I have seen none to equal it except Quilon, and Calicut in India, the port of the infidels, Genoese, at Sudak in the land of the Turks, and the port of Zaitun in China, all of which will be described later. I went to see the lighthouse on this occasion and found one of its faces in ruins. It is a very high square building, and its door is above the level of the earth. Opposite the door, and of the same height, is a building from which there is a plank bridge to the door. If this is removed, there is no means of entrance. Inside the door is a place for the lighthouse keeper, and within the lighthouse there are many chambers. The breadth of the passage inside is 9 spans, and that of the wall 10 spans. Each of the 4 sides of the lighthouse is 140 spans in breadth, and it is situated on a high mound and lies 3 miles from the city on a long tongue of land, which juts out into the sea from close by the city wall, so that the lighthouse cannot be reached by land except from the city. Another of the marvellous things in the city is the awe-inspiring marble column in its outskirts, which they call the Pillar of Columns. It is a single block, skillfully carved, crafted on a plinth with square stones like enormous platforms. For some clarification, the Pillar of Columns that he mentions is Pompey's Pillar, the triumphal column which, despite its name, honours Diocletian rather than Pompey. While in Alexandria, Ibn Battuta also met 2 sheikhs, one who asked Ibn Battuta to pass on his greetings to his brothers in India, Sind and China, and the other interpreted a dream that he had, which said that he was destined to become a great world traveller. Now, the only source for these sheikhs' predictions is Ibn Battuta's autobiography, so whether or not it's accurate and how much is his overreactive writing and storytelling is up to you. Anyway, Ibn Battuta spent several weeks in and around Alexandria, visiting various sites before heading to Cairo, the then capital of the Mamluk Sultanate. He spent about a month here before moving on. During his stay of about a month in the city, Ibn Battuta toured the monuments of the Bahri Mamluks, as well as the mosques and mausoleums of earlier dynasties. Among the structures which most impressed Ibn Battuta was their Maristan, or hospital. Today a sad shell of crumbling walls, it was one of the finest architectural creations of the age. While he was in Cairo, he decided, because of course he did, to choose the least travelled route to Mecca, which would take him up the Nile Valley and then east to Ajab on the Red Sea. Before he reached the port, though, a local rebellion forced him to turn back and return to Cairo. When earlier he had passed the town of Hugh on the Nile, he paid a visit to the saintly Sharif, one Abu Muhammad Abdallah al-Hassani. Upon hearing the young man's intention to go to Mecca, the Sharif warned him to return to Cairo, prophesying that he would not make his first pilgrimage except by the road through Syria. Ignoring the omen, Ibn Battuta had continued on his way southward. Reaching Ajab, he discovered much to his chagrin that the local ruling family, a clan of the Bahar people who inhabited the hills behind the city, were in revolt against the Mamluk governor. The rebels had sunk some ships in the harbour, driven out the Egyptian garrison, and in this climate of violence no one was hoisting sail for Jeddah. If he were to be assured of reaching the Hijaz before the start of the Hajj, Ibn Battuta had no real choice but to retrace his steps to Cairo and continue from there by one of the northern routes. Upon returning to Cairo, he decided to head north, to Damascus, which held many historical sites that he would have taken a keen interest in seeing. And due to the holy sites of Hebron, Jerusalem and Bethlehem that lay along the way, the Mamluk government spared no expense in keeping this road clear, meaning that he would have been able to travel to Damascus in relative safety. He spent the month of Ramadan in Damascus at this time being a great centre of learning that would have certainly interested Ibn Battuta, and he spent most of his time in various classes and lectures at the Great Mosque. During part of his stay in the city, Ibn Battuta boarded in one of the 3 Maliki madrasas there. Malikism was the least important of the 4 legal schools in Syria, and was represented by fewer colleges than the others. But he may have fairly lived in the Great Mosque, sitting beneath the marble columns of the Golden Dome Sanctuary. All around him the murmuring voices of lecturers and Quranic readers, and children in circles reciting their sacred lessons. The prayer hall, a 3-aisled nave more than 400 feet long, was open on its northern side and joined to a spacious court rimmed by arcades where, according to the Rila, the people of the city gather, in the evenings some reading, some conversing, and some walking up and down. The staff of officials attached to the mosque was huge, including, Ibn Battuta tells us, 70 muezzins, prayer callers, 13 imams, prayer leaders, and about 600 Quranic reciters. He describes the sanctuary as a place of continuous religious and educational activity, a never-ending celebration of God's glory and beneficence. In the advanced curriculum, the professor usually read and offered commentary on a classical book, then tested his students' ability to recite it as well as understand its meaning. He awarded those who performed competently an ijaza, or certificate, which entitled them to teach the same text to others. In the Rila, Ibn Battuta claims to have taken instruction and received ijazas from no less than 14 different teachers. The centre of learning and religious sites of Damascus is probably nothing more than a lucky coincidence, though, as Ibn Battuta had actually gone to Damascus to join a large caravan of pilgrims that were making their way to Medina on the Hajj. Now, Ibn Battuta doesn't give any kind of insight on how big this caravan was. However, Frescobaldi, a Florentine nobleman who happened to be in Damascus at the time, gives the caravan a number of about 20,000. The distance from Damascus to Medina is about 120 miles, and the caravan usually took anywhere between 45 and 50 days to complete this. These types of caravans are also known to be quite dangerous, with pilgrims dying from thirst, exposure, attacks from local nomads, flash floods, and disease, although Ibn Battuta doesn't know any particularly bad tragedies happening upon his own caravan. What he does give us, though, is a detailed account of the route that the caravan takes. From Damascus, the trail runs southward along the fringe of the Syrian desert to the oasis of Man, located on about the same latitude as Cairo. From there, the route turns slightly southeastward, veering away from the Gulf of Kaaba and running through the interior highlands along the eastern flank of the Hijaz Mountains. At Tabu, the northern gateway to Arabia, the caravan stopped for a few days while the pilgrims rested and watered their camels, before venturing into the fierce lands of nude mountains and vast black lava fields that lay between there and Medina. But Ibn Battuta, keen to complete his pilgrimage, only stayed in Medina for 4 days before moving on to Mecca. Here he finally completed his first pilgrimage, and added the honorific status of El-Hajji to reflect this. But now he was faced with a choice. He could, as he had likely intended when he first left Tangier, return home, or he could continue his travels. And he decided that returning to Morocco would have to wait, as he soon set out on a new journey to the Il Khanate, a Mongol Khanate to the northeast. On the 17th of November 1326, Ibn Battuta joined a caravan of pilgrims that was heading to Iraq via the Arabian Peninsula. The group headed to Medina and then, travelling at night, turned northeast across the Najd Plateau to Najaf, where he visited the mausoleum of Ali, the fourth caliph. Here Ibn Battuta and his caravan parted ways as the caravan travelled to Baghdad, while he went on to Wazit and then followed the river Tigris south to Basra. We went on from there and alighted in the town of Mashhad Ali at Najaf. It is a fine town, situated in a wide rocky plain, one of the finest, most populous and most substantially built cities in Iraq. It has beautiful clean bazaars. We entered by the outer Bab al-Hadra, after which we came to the inner Bab al-Hadra, where there is a tomb, which they say is the tomb of Ali. After our visit to the tomb of the Caliph Ali, the caravan went on to Baghdad, but I set out for Basra, in the company of a large troop of the Arab inhabitants of that country. Our way lay along the Euphrates by the place called Al-Hidar, which is a waterlogged jungle of reeds inhabited by Arabs noted for their predatory habits. 3 days' march through this district brought us to the town of Wazit. As the caravan stayed here 3 days, I had an opportunity of visiting the grave of Ar-Rafai, which is at a village called Ubaida, 1 day's journey from there. I returned to Wazit and found that the caravan had already started, but overtook them on the approach and accompanied them to Basra. From here, he would make his way to several other cities before heading to Baghdad. First, he crosses the Zagros Mountains to visit Isfahan, then went on to Shiraz, a large and flourishing city that had escaped destruction by the Mongol invaders, unlike so many of the other northern cities. Here he then crossed back across the mountains and arrived in Baghdad by June 1327, and seems to have been suitably impressed by the city, despite large parts of the city still being in ruins from its sacking by the Mongols. Thence we travelled to Baghdad, the abode of peace and capital of Islam. Here there are 2 bridges, like that at Hilla, on which the promenade night and day, both men and women. The town has 11 cathedral mosques, 8 on the right bank and 3 on the left, together with very many other mosques and madrasas, only the latter are all in ruins. The baths at Baghdad are numerous and excellently constructed, most of them being painted with pitch, which has the appearance of black marble. The western part of Baghdad was the earliest rebuilt, but it is now for the most part in ruins. In spite of that, there remain in it still 13 quarters, each like a city in itself and possessing 2 or 3 baths. The hospital, Maristan, is a vast ruined edifice, of which only vestiges remain. The eastern part is an abundance of bazaars, the largest of which is called the Tuesday Bazaar. But of course he had no intention of staying in Baghdad for very long, and soon got a chance to leave. Soon after he arrived, Sultan Abu Sa'id was leaving the city with a large retinue, and Ibn Battuta saw his chance to leave, travelling with the troops to find out how the Sultan's marches were conducted. I left Baghdad with Mahala as Sultan Abu Sa'id on purpose to see the way in which the king's marches are conducted, and travelled with it for 10 days, thereafter accompanying one of the emirs to the town of Tabriz. We reached the town after 10 days travelling and encamped outside it in a place called Ash-Sham. We spent only one night at Tabriz. The next day the emir reached an order from the Sultan to rejoin him, so I returned along with him, without having seen any of the learned men there. On reaching the camp, the emir told the Sultan about me and introduced me into his presence. The Sultan asked me about my country and gave me a robe and a horse. The emir told him that I was intending to go to the Hijaz, whereupon he gave orders for me to be supplied with provisions and to travel with the cortege of the commander of the pilgrim caravan, and wrote instructions to that effect to the governor of Baghdad. Indeed, Ibn Battuta did return to Baghdad, but there was still 2 months before the caravan would leave the city, which Ibn Battuta thought was plenty of time to visit Mosul, where he stayed as a guest of the Ilkhanate governor. He then made other excursions to the town of Kisra and Mardin, both in modern-day Turkey. He then turned back to Mosul, joined a small caravan that was heading to Baghdad, where they would join a larger caravan. And so, in 1327, Ibn Battuta completed his second Hajj. Now, Ibn Battuta remained in Mecca for some time, but we don't know exactly how long. The Realer, Ibn Battuta's biography, suggests 3 years. However, there are some issues with chronology, and more modern estimates suggest that he may have left the city as early as 1328, making his stay in Mecca just 1 year. Now, this isn't a particularly big issue, but it does bring up an issue with the Realer, which is that it's all been dictated from memory. Ibn Battuta kept no written notes or diaries during his journey, and he dictated the Realer only after he returned home, meaning the accounts of his earlier journeys are being recalled directly from memory more than 20 years old. There are going to be some issues with accuracy. Regardless of when he left, he did leave, and he made his way to Jeddah on the Red Sea. From there he made his way slowly to Yemen, travelling by sea against the southeasterly winds. When he finally arrived in Yemen, he went to Zabid, before moving on to the town of Taiz, where he met the Rassalid dynasty king, Mujahid Nur al-Din Ali. He then made his way to Aden, arriving in either 1329 or 1331. I travelled in his company to Jeddah, and when I came to his city he assigned me a lodging as his guest for some days. I embarked on a ship of his and reached the township of Al-Sajah. We stayed at Al-Sajah only 1 night, then continued our journey to the roadstead of Al-Hadith, where we did not land, thence on to the roadstead of Al-Hawab, and then rode to the city of Zabid, a great city in Al-Yaman. It is a great and populous city, and contains groves of palms, orchards, and running streams. In fact, the pleasantest and most beautiful town in all of Al-Yaman. Its inhabitants are courteous in manners, upright in conduct, and handsome in figure, and its women are of exceeding and preeminent beauty. We proceeded to the city of Taiz, the capital of the king of Al-Yaman. It is one of the finest and largest of the cities of Al-Yaman. Its people are overbearing, insolent, and rude, as is generally the case in towns where kings have their seats. So Ibn Battuta is in Aden, and it's here that he decides to take a ship that was heading south to the port of Zaila in Somalia. Here he spent about a week before moving on to Cape Gardafui, even further down the Somali coast. He spent another week here before finally travelling to Mogadishu, the preeminent Somali city at the time, and the likely reason Ibn Battuta had travelled to Somalia in the first place. He arrived in Mogadishu in 1331, when the city was at the height of its prosperity, and he seems to have liked it, or at least he had nothing negative to say about it, unlike most capital cities he visited. I took a ship at Aden, and after 4 days at sea reached Zaila, the town of the Berbera, who are a Negro people. Their land is a desert extending for 2 months' journey from Zaila to Magdashore. Zaila is a large city with a great bazaar, but it is the dirtiest, most abominable and most stinking town in the world. The reason for the stench is the quantity of its fish, and the blood of the camels that they slaughter in the streets. When we got there, we chose to spend the night at sea, in spite of its extreme roughness, rather than in the town, because of its filth. On leaving Zaila, we sailed for 15 days, and came to Magdashore, which is an enormous town. Its inhabitants are merchants and have many camels, of which they slaughter hundreds every day. I embarked back to shore for the Swahili country, with the object of visiting the town of Kulwa. If you're paying attention and good at geography, you'll have picked up that Ibn Battuta is now heading to the Swahili coast, a part of East Africa just below the Horn of Africa. This voyage will also mark the furthest south that he will ever travel in the world, not just in Africa. While his destination may have been Kilwa, his first port of call was Mombasa, which, while small when Ibn Battuta visited it, would become a major centre of trade within the next century. But he only stayed in Mombasa one night before continuing on, and this time he did get to Kilwa, in modern-day Tanzania. Ibn Battuta absolutely loved Kilwa, commenting favourably on both the architecture and the ruler at the time, Sultan Al-Hassan ibn Suleiman. We came to Mombasa, a large island 2 days' journey by sea from the Swahili country. It possesses no territory on the mainland. They have fruit trees on the island, but no cereals, which have to be brought to them from the Swahili. Their food consists chiefly of bananas and fish. The inhabitants are pious, honourable and upright, and they have well-built wooden mosques. We stayed one night in this island and then pursued our journey to Kulwa, which is a large town on the coast. The majority of its inhabitants are Zanj, jet black in colour and with tattoo marks on their faces. Kulwa is a very fine and substantially built town, and all its buildings are of wood. Its inhabitants are constantly engaged in military expeditions, for their country is contiguous to the heathen Zanj. The Sultan at the time I visited was Abul Muzaffar Hassan, who was noted for his gifts and generosity. He used to devote the fifth part of his booty made in his expeditions to pious and charitable purposes, as is prescribed in the Quran, and I have seen him give the clothes off his back to a mendicant who asked him for them. From Kilwa, Ibn Battuta decided that it was high time he returned to Arabia, more specifically Mecca, for the Hajj of 1332, bringing his total number of religious pilgrimages up to 3. Upon the completion of his third pilgrimage to Mecca, Ibn Battuta decided that the time was right for him to take employment up at the Sultanate of Delhi in India, because of course that's what he decided to do. To get to India, he decided the best route to take was to travel north through Anatolia, but not without some side stops. He first crossed the Red Sea and Eastern Desert to reach the Nile Valley, and then headed north to Cairo. From there he crossed the Sinai Peninsula and kept heading north, revisiting many of the towns he had stayed at previously. While in the Syrian port of Latakia, a ship took him to Alanya, a port on the southern coast of Anatolia. I took ship for Ajab, but we were driven to a roadstead to Ras Dordir, from which we made our way with some bahars through the desert to Ajab. Thence we travelled to Edfu and down the Nile to Cairo, where I stayed for a few days. Then set out for Syria and passed for the second time through Gaza, Hebron, Jerusalem, Ramla, Acre, Tripoli and Jabala to Iadikia. At Iadikia we embarked on a large galley belonging to the Genoese and set out for the country of the Turks known as Bilad Arum, Anatolia. We were 10 nights at sea and the Christians treated us kindly and took no passage money from us. On the 10th day we reached Alea, where the province begins. This country is one of the best in the world. In it, God has united the good features dispersed throughout other lands. Its people are the most comely of men, the cleanest in their dress, the most exquisite in their food, and the kindliest folk in the creation. The city of Alea is a large town on the seacoast. It is inhabited by Turkmens and is visited by the merchants of Cairo, Alexandria, and Syria. But instead of heading east to India, he instead headed west to Antalya. Here he met the members of one of the Fichan associations, basically groups of young artisans who specialised in welcoming and housing travellers. In fact, Ibn Battuta was so impressed by the hospitality that he would end up staying in their lodges in more than 20 of the towns in Anatolia. Now, in the lands inhabited by the Turkmens in Anatolia, in every district, town and village, there are to be found members of the organisation known as Yakila, or Young Brotherhood. Nowhere in the world will you find men so eager to welcome strangers, so prompt to serve food and to satisfy the wants of others, and so ready to suppress injustice and to kill tyrannical agents of police and the miscreants who join with them. From Antalya, Ibn Battuta headed to Agadir, the then capital of the Hammadids, and he spent Ramadan there. Now, the relay here becomes a little bit confusing. Ibn Battuta insists that he continued heading west to Milas, but then he somehow jumps 420 kilometers east to Konya. He then apparently keeps heading east to Erzurum, but then somehow skips the whopping 1,160 kilometers west to Burgi. So what happened? Well, the general consensus today is that Ibn Battuta did visit several towns in Anatolia, just not in the order recounted in the Rila, and he may have also confused towns with each other. Remember, the Rila is an account of a journey that lasted nearly 25 years, being called purely from memory. We can't expect 100% accuracy. However his travels went, he eventually ended up in Sinope, which would start his travels into Central Asia. I'm actually going to stop this video here. If this feels like an abrupt ending, that's because it is. We're only about a third of the way through Ibn Battuta's story. The reason I'm ending this video here, though, is because I want to split up this story into several parts, because it's just too long otherwise. I actually recorded the audio, all of the audio, a couple of days ago, and it's way over an hour long. So if I were to put it all into one video, it wouldn't be out for another month. This way, you get a video, and I get to not have to edit an hour and a half video. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for the next part in the series, which should be out in about a week. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you again for getting me to 100 subscribers. We're actually at about 115 now, I think, so thank you so much, and hopefully we can continue that growth. A few of you have said that I could potentially be quite successful on YouTube if I put out videos more regularly. That's just not going to happen. Simply because I like my videos to be well researched, which takes time, and I have a full-time job, which also takes time. So I only get a few days out of a week to do my videos. So yeah, me putting out videos more frequently, like every week or every fortnight, just isn't going to happen until I've grown substantially. Alright, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in a week. Bye.